I see some of you discovered our little Google Doc up here. So this is scheduled to be a roundtable, which means we really want to hear more from you guys than from us. If we felt like we were the experts on this, this would be a panel, and a lot of other people would be up here instead of us, probably. So we feel like this is a topic area that and there's a fair number of you, so some of you at least agree, that's really important to our industry going forward, and which really hasn't gotten perhaps as much attention as we'd like it to. So that's the goal here is to try to elicit as much knowledge from the community here as possible and get it into one place, or at least sort of out in the open all at the same time. So that's sort of the format we're going to try to go for here. In terms of how we're going to run this is a little different. Usually a round table has a table, whether it's round or not, and people sit around it. So there'll be some potential logistical issues here. If you want a mic, I would much rather have you guys talking than us. So if you have anything at all to say, just stick your hand up and I'll come up and stick a mic into your hand. Also, if you don't want to talk, we have this lovely tool here that we're hoping people will take advantage of to write down what's happening right now, if they think that it's an important point that needs to be addressed, or a question or a concern maybe that they have that hasn't been brought up. Maybe they don't want to get up and talk into a mic, but they want it to come up. So please use this throughout this process. If you have any questions or anything you can do, or anything you want to know about how it's working, please let us know. If it doesn't work, if you can't get into it, let us know that too, because we've never tried this before. We don't really know if it's going to work. So we do have a couple of questions to sort of kick this off. I'm Adams Greenwood Erickson, by the way. Pleasure to meet y'all. And this is?
I'm Juliana Guryanov, UX Lab Analyst at Epic Games.
And I teach at Full Sail University, and also work in the UX lab there. So, and I guess you have a couple questions to start with, right? Yep.
So first of all, welcome. And how many of you, by show of hands, have done any kind of testing relating to narrative in particular? All right, great. So we've had, by talking to people and doing some research, we've seen some articles and talks by Jonathan Tankoff, Deborah Henderson, and a few others, some from Amsterdam as well, talking about this, but we haven't seen a larger body of research on this. So we just wanted to get you guys together to talk about it. So anything that you guys have seen have worked so far or hasn't, anything that you feel has been effective in that area, or that you would like to see practiced more? That would be the question. Yeah.
Well, I'll quickly just start, but if you're interested, there was not at Games UR San Francisco, but the one in London. I gave a talk there, and it's free online. So if anybody's interested in spending an hour listening to me talk more, you can do that. And I talked a little bit about that. I don't know if you want me to give like the top lines, but it was very quickly. It was just a very simple method to take scripts, like production materials, so you don't have to wait for them to go into the game, and apply a rudimentary research method using writers and peers from the design team to give feedback. Honestly, it's a very simple framework for doing research on narrative, but nobody was doing it, so I guess I get to be the guy that made it up, I guess. But and then I know that some of the guys at Sony were working on a similar methodology with a different approach, and we chatted after that, and we sort of both found ways to steal from one another and cross-pollinate. He had a really interesting approach on using players that I don't know if he wants me to talk about, but it was very interesting. Oh, there you are. Yeah. So he taught me some cool new ways to do it, and I think you stole a little from me, I hope, maybe. But there's certainly people working in collaboration on attacking this topic of making better stories, especially now as we move into systemic games with player narrative rather than fully authorial narrative. It gets even weirder, and it's more and more exciting, not less. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop talking.
Yeah, those are some great points. Anybody have anyone want to address that? I see hands. Oh, all right.
This is a question for the folks who do study narrative. When you're studying it, what are you assessing? Are you assessing against like goodness or against conveyance? Like what have you historically been tasked with in engaging on that?
So I haven't run it in like a year, but if I remember correctly, there were 5 things that I was looking for that I worked with the team of writers of what did they think was important. And given that it's not a big part of the reason I used peers from the design community and from other writers is because they can speak the same language. And so we were able to ask more craft-oriented questions that they could answer sort of from the same perspective. And really, from a participant, we found a lot of the answers we got were, is this good or bad? But from writers and from designers, you could ask, does this make sense? Is this part of the character's journey that you would expect? And you can track it over the chapters. Certainly, is this good or bad was part of it. But there were other more granular pieces of information that we were really looking at to try to see where you could tweak it, where people were losing interest, where parts of the story, looking for narrative dissonance. So, like, it makes absolutely no sense for example, I'm going to take a crazy example, made it up right now, for an assassin to find a coat and then be able to teach the Templars how to be assassins. That doesn't work. That's just right off the top of the dome there. But looking for things like that, trying to find how we could help tweak the script. And it wasn't so much like we want to take it from 4.1 good to 4.5 good. It was really looking, as writers and as designers who are going to be putting this in the game, where are the weak points that we can workshop together, and where are the parts that that work really strongly and that we shouldn't touch too much? Does that sort of answer it?
So before we pick up, there's actually a reference that's directly related to this that we were looking at when we were doing some research for this. There's a paper, 2013 paper, by someone with a name even longer, more complicated than mine. Someone named Sandy Henrik Schonau-Fogg and Soto Sanfiel, so Theodore Lim and Maria Teresa Soto Sanfiel on narrative engagement in games. And they actually proposed a really interesting, I'll try to get that link up here in a minute when I'm not talking anymore, but a really interesting point about the sort of continuation as being a tool. Like, how much do they want to continue the game? And that sort of gets at this, and that also has to do with like what they remember in there as well. There was somebody looked at this at a GDC talk last year, 2 years ago. Deborah Henderson has looked at this for sure, and then there was one called Down with the 3 Acts play. We have a reference on this too. I'll try to get into the sheet here that looks at sort of talking about how they found empirically that people remember the first part and the last part, not much of the middle, which is obviously a problem for people who are trying to really craft a narrative that has that traditional 3-act structure. So that was something that would be relevant here. We'll try to get that in while other people are talking. I saw hands up over here. You both went up about the same time, so we'll just go left to right like good Westerners.
Wait, which left? This is a general question for people who have studied narrative, and we've tried to wrap our minds around this and haven't made much progress, but there's been a lot of research, well, not a lot, but there's been some research into general understanding or retention of narrative. But one thing I've been curious about is how the narrative actually affects the player's understanding of their goals and what they're doing at that time. For example, we have a lot of games where we've tested where after the fact, players will say, oh yeah, I had to go there to defeat this bad guy to get this thing. But if you ask them during the act, like before they actually reach their goal, they just say, I think I need to go that way. And they kind of retroactively understand the story and the narrative. I'm wondering, has anyone done any research into see how that affects the user experience, their satisfaction, and their ability to plan ahead at all?
Well, in this article that we just typed up, the researchers actually were looking at different dimensions of what would influence players' desire to continue. And some of it was actually characterization and how does your character's kind of actions later on, were they meeting expectations? Were they something that you thought were illogical as a player? This especially relates to open world games or games with lots of choices that you can make, where the player is set up throughout the game that they can keep building their own kind of personality. And sometimes at the end, you have very limited choices, and that might not go logically with the narrative that the player himself has been building. So, for example, like the Fallout 3, some inconsistencies, and Mass Effect 3 controversies. So.
Yeah, we went there.
So my background's in reading comprehension research, and there's a couple of ways we've assess narrative in readers. One of them is to write questions that tap details and questions that tap inferences. So one thing we did with Batman Arkham Knight was we asked people who Commissioner Gordon was, who Oracle was, and then we asked them an inferential question: why does Batman feel guilty? And so if you've played Arkham Knight, you'll understand what that is. So Oracle is Commissioner Gordon's daughter, and she was lying to Commissioner Gordon, pretended she'd been evacuated, but she wasn't. And what we found was that people who remembered the details of who Commissioner Gordon was and who Oracle was tended to reply to the inferential question that Batman feels guilty because Oracle's been lying to her father. And so if you create questions that tap details that go through the whole story to create coherence, then you often find that people will, as I say, understand the inferential questions too.
That's really interesting. It seems that you've been using like surveys or some qualitative data. Were there any other tools that you were using, like GSR?
Yeah, so in my last job we used memory for dialogue in stories. So you have people read the first 4 chapters of a novel, and then you show them a recognition test made up of sentences from those first 4 chapters, embedded amongst sentences in later chapters that they didn't read, and you see if they can discriminate between those 2 sentences. So they're written in the same style, so it's hard to tell that they're written, that they haven't read it or have. And people who are able to recognise the old sentences as old are also able to understand these comprehension questions as well. So they load together really well. They correlate really highly. And so what my old colleagues have started doing is just doing memory for dialogue and sentences from the chapters that people have read, and using that as like a proxy of comprehension, if you like. So there's kind of 2 ways.
Thank you.
Other thoughts on this sort of topic, or you guys want to move on? Looks like we've exhausted that one.
All right, so we can talk a bit more maybe about the techniques and tools that can be used. Being in the UX, we've all been exposed to things like, GSR, EEG, eye tracking. Do you guys think there's, what use would be for those kind of biometrics in relation to narrative in UX?
Okay, well, we've done it. So we had a student, Javier Munoz Caros, am I mispronouncing that? Yeah, who came out of our lab about a year ago. And he really looked into it. He was interested in how sort of people react to narrative over time and sort of story points, elements. And so what we were doing was galvanic skin response testing, which is looking at skin conductance level over time. And we looked at this while people were playing Tailworld's game, Game of Thrones. We weren't working for Tailworlds, I should be clear about that. This was just kind of a researchy thing we sort of did. And it was kind of interesting to watch because we could watch arousal levels go up and down throughout the course of the story. And we learned a couple of interesting things, one of which was that it was not complete consistency. Sometimes there'd be a point that seemed like it was really important and somebody wouldn't react at all. And then a little while later, they would kind of pop up or they were down. There were latency differences. And part of that, we thought, was probably because we know what they're seeing, but we don't really know what's going on internally, right? So I just got a story point. It may not sink in for a minute or two that something just happened or what that means. There's a sort of rich internal life that goes on. People are experiencing narrative, which is sort of, hey, well, what does this mean? How would I react if I were here? And all that stuff that percolates over time, and then suddenly we can see a reaction. There were, though, some cases, particular events where very clearly everybody reacted all at the same time. And so, maybe we can try to get that paper up somewhere where people can look at least find a link to it at some point. But that was, so we have done it with some success. There's a couple problems with it, of course, one of which is anytime you're dealing with series time data time data with a game, is that people don't hit the same points at the same time. You guys are probably very familiar with this problem. It happens in lots of different areas. But that makes biometrics sort of problematic because you can still take little snippets of time, but you got to watch out for latency and artifacts. The car alarm goes off outside and we get a big spike. It's just, there's a lot of stuff that goes into biometrics that makes it hard to really link it to what's going on, particularly when you remember that narrative is not it's not like you're just watching a video where you're responding to what you're seeing in the video. There's also a lot of sort of cumulative information that may at some point come to a head and cause people to change their viewpoints. So So we have some data on this, but it was by no means conclusive. I take it no one else has done anything with that, though, it sounds like. Anybody interested in that? Just sort of show of hands. Who cares? Anybody? All right, some of you at least, yeah. Well, maybe that's something we'll look at some more. So,
Did you guys do any?
hang on. I think you get to talk into the mic. Sorry.
Did you guys look at any other sort of compounding factors like the participants' working memory or cognitive load at the time, like to see how that affects the delay and understanding of the narrative or anything like that?
We did not. That wouldn't have been a bad idea, though. I mean, maybe a secondary task of some sort to sort of track task load. We haven't done it. We mostly were doing it because we just kind of wanted to see if we could, right? We weren't sure if we were just going to get mush where like spikes were all over the place, or the sort of typical problem we have when you're watching video game GSR data, which is like it's this big slow hill. You know, it's they keep getting more and more and more aroused. That was why we chose that particular game, because it has so many distinct narrative beats to it. There was this sort of real up and down character to the narrative that we thought we would see reflected in the GSR data, and to some degree we did. We also, I think, we did some pilot testing with the knob, the Nielsen rating knob, where you twist the knob to sort of how much you liked what was going on.
For trailers?
For trailers, yeah. We did that with some movie trailers, or game trailers, rather. But that's sort of a different application of that. We were thinking about doing it with a game, though, but again, you have that same sort of time sync problem.
Yeah, actually with that we also used a PES, player experience scale, to try and see, how they felt, if it was more of work or more of a game. But that was more on the side. It didn't exactly cross examine as what you're saying. Yeah.
So one of the reasons I didn't raise my hand about this particular method is I have a question around, and I'd love to hear just as many people who would want to answer this as possible. People answering the idea of what they're actually trying to evaluate a narrative, what their goal is, because full disclosure, I work with Deborah, and the thing that's driven home there is that very much it's a user-centered design philosophy, right? Where not understanding who the killer is in a mystery, probably good. Not understanding who the killer is in a revenge game, maybe not so good. So if people could talk about that, I'd love to hear that perspective.
Any volunteers?
Anybody has?
Excuse me? I wasn't sure if I was going to make that. That could have been ugly, yeah. Couldn't see a better way to get down.
Hi, I would love to answer this question because I'm not only a game user researcher, I'm also a writer who started to work on my own game, so I can give you the perspective of writing for a game and what I would like user research to help me. One thing I wanted to check by using game user research is about how do I represent properly people of diversity in my games, because I tried to do a game about LGBT and I wanted to be sure I talk in the best way about them, about their struggles and everything. So it was also like showing the script a lot to LGBT people, and also ask them about the ideas, the thing I wanted to change in the characters, if they think it's a good idea or not. Some other things is also because it's like kind of a puzzle game. Like trying to understand, to see if they manage to break the codes, and how do they do that, and what is their thinking, because you have to read the story in order to find the code. So what in the story lead them to find the codes and what didn't, and make them find the wrong one and get them confused. And also, good question, is it a good thing that they get confused and it takes them more time to find the solution to the puzzles?
So one of the things that I've seen happen in my tests when it comes to narrative is that with other media, the narrative is pretty much there to convey the story only. And in games, it's not only the story and the narrative, it's instructions as well. And so sometimes those two conflict. And so we'll have a point in a game, even in a linear game, where there's a simple choice to be made. And when users don't understand or don't appear to understand that there is a choice, is it a failure of the game design or is it a failure of the narrative design? And that's something that we've had a hard time sort of separating. And so we're giving some thought on as to how to accomplish that. So understanding the narrative isn't just about understanding those story beats. It's whether or not the user actually understands what they're meant to do, and then can they go out and accomplish those tasks. So it's complex questions.
That is a good point. Anybody else have anything to discuss in that context? So I wanted to respond to something you said. We actually had this later on the list, but diversity is something that we in the game industry historically do not maybe do the best possible job of. I'm seeing a lot of wry nodding around the room here. So we at least know that, right? And that's, of course, complicated by a number of factors, one of which is we don't really know what we mean when we say diversity a lot of the time. Like, we tend to define it as, do we have enough of ethnic or cultural group A or group B, group C, which is one way of looking at diversity, but isn't really about diversity in terms of viewpoints necessarily. I mean, people of different ethnic groups who are all software engineers probably are more similar than they are, than they are different. So I was wondering, when you were looking at this, were you bringing in people who were sort of I mean, how did you decide who you were going to show it to, in terms of, because you want to avoid tokenism, obviously, right? Like, you check a couple of boxes, therefore you're my expert on this. How did you look at that? If you can tell us a little more about that, I'm kind of curious to know myself.
So my game was also made to raise awareness about the problem. So it's not like a game where you talk about an assassin and LGBT characters in it. It's like really about LGBT people and their struggles. So basically, I had two kinds of publics that I wanted to test my game. The first one was, of course, LGBT people, but also some people who don't know anything about LGBT, like they don't even know what LGBT stands for, and to see if they understand the game. And I realized that lots of things that I was thinking that was really clear and was not, because they don't know anyone who is LGBT and they don't know the struggle and they get confused. They think bisexual is the same thing that transgender, for example. And so that also was a way to change the script, because realizing that you have to reach to completely different audience than don't know about your topic at the same level.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a challenge that I think we had talked about as being something we see. I mean, there's been a number of controversies about this. So I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on you guys for a minute, because Assassin's Creed attracted a few. Okay, that's true. You don't care, right? So Assassin's Creed as a franchise has attracted a number of criticisms that are sort of based on diversity or diversity-related elements, like the portrayal of Middle Eastern characters relative to Western characters, the portrayal of women, for instance, as active agents in video games has been. I mean, there's always controversy over everything, right? I mean, it's the game industry. A ham sandwich is controversial in the right context here, but that was something that we saw come up, where we sort of noticed happen in questions about authenticity, all of those things. Does anybody have any insight into that or any thoughts about that? Because that's something we really kind of wanted to know, if anybody has looked at that or knows anything about it. Crickets. Oh, hey. All right. I'm not going to do the jump up thing anymore. I'm too old for this.
So there's not empirical data that I know of on this, but in terms of the way that players talk about a lot of games, in terms of the way that non-heterosexual relationships are presented, it tends to be more of a, here is a straight relationship, but we'll change the guy to be a girl, and like that's it, rather than addressing the ways that kind of fits into how do these other characters react to that, how does the world react to that, how does this fit into, because a lot of times it's just like, oh, and it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight or like whatever, it's fine now, and they're not really engaging with the issues in a meaningful way through narrative. But I think the only way to get to a point where we understand how to evaluate that is to bring in LGBT and other queer players to get their life experiences and determine how we can work those into the narratives that we're creating, because that's not happening right now. It tends to be more heteronormative, white, pretty standard for just based on like what I've seen in terms of the player community discussion about it.
So I'm actually doing demographics research right now, and I'm going to be looking at comparing the demographics of games across genres from 2012 to 2014. So a lot of my literature review has been, and I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but Hispanic Black characters tend to make up 10% or less of total game characters. And women have been present about 86% of the time as secondary characters, but are equal in the amount of representation they have as player characters. But it's still limited, but it's better from where we were in 1998, but it is not anywhere where it needs to be. So there is a whole set of demographics data that has shown, but it's still not going to match the amount of women who are currently playing.
Yeah, that's actually that's really cool. In fact, let me use my card, and you can if you have anything we can look at, we'll post it up here. So if you guys hang on to this link, we'll try to update this as people maybe if we get more information in the future, we can keep that stuff flowing. I thought the point about sort of diversity in this context, I don't want to beat this to death, but sort of really was a good point about how basically we've taken what were existing heteronormative relationships and just kind of changed one character to be superficially different. Was a good point. It's too bad that James Berg, are you in here? No? Yeah, I didn't think so. It's too bad. Because I know James worked on Inquisition, and there were a number of things that came up in that context. There was a really interesting article about how the person who was writing, I think it was Dorian in this storyline, had to rewrite the character. Like he'd written the character originally, and he took it to a couple of people he knew who were LGBTQ, and they looked at it and they said, "This is all wrong. You need to change this and this and this and this and this." So this is sort of, again, why I think why a roundtable is a good format for this, and because there's a lot of little bits of information out there. Like, I wish I could remember who that was, because I would love to be able to hear what they have to say about this. So that's something we'd really like to see as we go forward about just sort of general narrative topics. Everything seems very scattered. There's like a Kotaku article over here, and there's a paper published in some obscure peer-reviewed journal over here, and a GDC talk over there, but there's really no unity of it. So it's great that Deborah. We were trying to figure out what had happened to her, because she was sort of got us thinking about this 3 or 4 years ago, and we were like, wow, why has nobody looked at this? And then she was gone, and so I'm glad to hear she's still well. So that's good. That's great. Yeah. Well, hopefully. Yeah. I mean, this of course is always a problem in the game industry, is most of us are not academics, and so we can't publish what we know. In the university system, we have the advantage that we can publish things that we find. I know that's not true of everybody. I suspect there's probably somebody here who's like, God, I would love to say this thing, but I can't. But that's, at least the more we can get up there, the better. Is there a... Oh, good. Yeah, that's a great question. All right. Yeah, so does anybody have experience with testing branching narrative? Were we talking about like large-scale branching narrative, like whole different storylines? Or are we talking about, I'm not trying to out whoever was doing this, but like this sort of two ways to look at this. One is like, do I get a choice, and then does it carry on? The other is like, does that affect the whole arc of the story? Right? Is this sort of a tactical, how do I represent that the world is changing question, or is this a, I want to avoid the Mass Effect 3 ending controversy again? I know, I went there twice, right? Yeah, it's. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So and I think those are all on either YouTube or Vimeo. Oh, that's right. So yeah, James. Good. Thank you. So James Berg's talk from last year, from GOR last year, covered some of this stuff when he was talking about Inquisition. He had a really long, really interesting talk. So if you haven't seen that already from last year's video, I would go try to find it. I think it's on YouTube. Some of these are on YouTube. They're spread around. If you type in James Berg, Dragon Age Inquisition, and look for videos, you'll probably be able to turn it up. If anybody gets a link to it, please throw it up there, because that was a really great talk. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and actually, in relation to this, A Choice of Games, the company which does textual adventures, they actually talked about a delayed branching type of a structure, where whatever the player is choosing is actually going into certain stats. and it's not entirely transparent. So it's not like in pen and paper D&D where you just put in some stats into whatever, charisma or something that you want. It's based on what you're, on the choices. And it's not very sort of good or bad kind of binary. It's more like, brutality or finesse. And there's like a few different ones which you might not necessarily, which might be good or bad depending on the situation. So the way that it affects the game itself is that it tracks the stats, and over time, whenever you have another choice to make, the result of that will be affected by the stats. So that won't necessarily, not let you choose something, but it will affect what's going to happen if you choose that. That path. And yeah, go ahead.
This is not a user research approach to branching narrative, but the book Video Games for Humans is about twine games, which are mostly branching narrative games, and has a lot of narrative examination of those different games.
Getting my exercise in today.
So we actually did a game that had a pretty rudimentary branching path, and it was pretty black and white, morality system. We did some very basic level narrative comprehension and player attitudes towards that narrative, and it actually did affect the developer's decision to go with specific story beats. However, in our case, kind of going back to an earlier point that I made, was that the branching paths were very closely tied to gameplay decisions and in-game powers and stats and stuff, so it really clouded the reasoning for players choosing the one path or another, because once you kind of lock into one path, if you start to go against that path, it could actually be bad for the player's actual character development or character progression, power progression. So while we saw players have some negativity towards specific story beats in certain paths, they stuck with it anyway because they knew they had to maximize their power within the game. So again, the gameplay and story can often compete for attention when it comes to comprehension and just overall enjoyment.
I think that's a great point. We actually, if you guys, those of you who played Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3, had a great illustration of that. Mass Effect 2, once you committed to, and 1 as well, once you committed to a Paragon or Renegade path, you kind of had to stick with it in order to get certain outcomes, which were sort of on a purely sort of tactical standpoint, whereas 3 introduced I think it was Renown or something like that, of visibility, like a system that was sort of independent of those two, so you could combine both Paragon and Renegade values to improve your, that conversational power stat, such as it was. So I think people have seen this in the industry and are trying to do things with it. But it's great that you guys have worked with that too, and that you have some experience with it. Does anybody else have any comments on branching narrative or questions? We did one thing on the tactical side of this. Julie and I are actually running a study right now. We're looking at how players decide among different sort of text-based answer choices. So a lot of games do this where they try to indicate that there's something special about an answer choice, right? So like either it requires a stat test, or it takes a certain approach versus another approach. And like we were talking about Mass Effect, it'd be like the Paragon versus Renegade type path. You see this in other contexts. I think an interesting one was back in the game Jade Empire, which is like 2010, the sort of way of the open palm versus the way of the closed fist, which is not necessarily good or bad, just sort of different approaches to the world. And we were trying to look at this in the context of, not necessarily the deeper underlying narrative piece, so maybe it's not the best fit for this, but more in the context of the interface side of it, which is how do they know? I mean, people sort of generally, we did research on this, people sort of generally thought that the way in which Dragon Age 2 represented the types of decision-making you were using was not as good as in Dragon Age 1 and not as good as in Dragon Age 3. At least that was the sort of the sense we got from people complaining about it in the forums. But we weren't really sure why. Was it because the icons were different and maybe they just happened to be less clear? Was it because of the color coding? So we're doing an empirical study right now. We're sort of digging into that, trying different approaches and looking to see how people respond to them. But we just started pilot data, so we have no actual results on that yet. But maybe next year we can talk about that. So no other thoughts on branching? Yeah. Oh, now we do. Okay.
I just think this is kind of interesting. So when we did a lot of testing on Pillars of Eternity, because there's quite a bit of branching in that story, one of the things that really resonated with some of the users that we tested it with, but also the developers, once they realized that this was something that we could do, was the differing of stories that changed based on the interactions that you had with the characters, and like as you use them in certain circumstances or certain battles, how it affected them as a character and would change their responses to certain things, and therefore your responses that you could have unlocked. And some of the feedback that we got from this, particularly for branching, was that people who played the game many times over felt like they were never playing the same game, right? And so that made their experience, like the experience that they had, better, like trifold. So I know it was just very interesting because when I think of branching games, like initially, I don't think of divergent stories at all. I think of like you have options, and then you make an option, and then you get to an end goal, which is ultimately what you do with Pillars. But the stories that you experience in the game were so vastly different from one another through the characters themselves, not necessarily your story, that it really did feel like completely different games. And the fact that we got that feedback consistently after testing the game, I think was incredible. And also set a lot toward narrative gaming pushing, moving forward. So, just interesting.
Yeah, I remember noticing that when I was playing Pillars, although I also noticed that the druids were ridiculously overpowered. I'm just putting that out there. I'm sure you've never heard that before, yeah. So other thoughts on branching? I thought I saw at least one more hand, or maybe somebody was waving a pencil in the air. No.
Yeah, and that was really interesting. I'm just wondering, you said that you were gathering that information afterwards. So do you have any thoughts about if it would be valuable to have that while you're developing, and would that require really long kind of tests, or how would you do it, like, when the game is not yet finished?
Yeah, so a lot of this, it was feedback like after or as we were going to launch Pillars, right? But we had already had plans for the expansions at that point. So we wanted to do more extensive testing so that we could make sure that this was something that that users, considering how much they liked it, could be reflected in the new games. And so the testing for it was just base protocols of how do we get them to play through the game, and then kind of subtly suggest that they do different things, and without forcing it, right? We don't want to force them to be like, oh, play this game, play that game, and then use various user groups and different types of players, casuals, etc., to see what interactions they have. We had a couple super users that we played that played the game various times through. This is how we found out that you could. We knew that you could do this, but how they found out they could do it was to have super users play through it. And I remember one individual who was actually like, I feel like I played a completely different game and I'm emotionally wrecked over it. And I was like, I'm so sorry. But I think, that was actually, it was the testing on Pillars that we did after we launched and realized that it was the narrative aspect of the game that really brought more people to understanding, like, wow, there's so much versatility here. That really made us as a company kind of go, wow, like we could really put a lot of time into testing just the narrative, and we really should. And it's kind of what we're known for too, is putting out stories. And so it kind of like started this whole ball rolling thing moving forward. So everyone should definitely look out for new stories on that stuff. But the testing took weeks just to like figure out how to do it correctly. Because at first it was just like, let's see what happens, and now it's kind of it's a continuous thing, if anyone wants to test, we have new stories.
So I see we have a comment about pacing, which I want to get to because I know somebody wanted to ask about that, but it sounds like this is still going. Is there a question on this? Is that you wanted to address this here?
So talking about especially when a product's in development, talking about testing the narrative very early on, usually when we have we have the most potential for impact. I'm curious what people's thoughts and methodologies are around testing it in a way that mimics kind of that end user experience. A lot of the ways that I've seen it tested is here's like the script, or here's like the whole story back to back, whereas the end user sees it more like, I get a story beat. Here's 40 minutes of action. here's the next story beat. Here's another 40 minutes. And I don't know, I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts or ideas around how do you best test that and keep your data valid.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually had that on our list for something like that on our list for later. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or at least thoughts that they can share? Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to.
Well, I think, yeah, I'd started with just pure text, and a wonderful person suggested that I start mixing in images and maybe using some video and just making it more multimedia. And because the truth is that early on, you probably don't have a lot of assets, so getting away from pure pen and paper words on a screen can be difficult. But you might have concept art, or maybe you have a mood trailer, or maybe you have some of those. And so you can spice it up a little bit and make it a little bit more interesting with whatever's available, and talk to your art team and see what they've got in terms of assets that you can roll into the places to give the script a little bit more life. I haven't done that yet, but it sounded like a really good idea.
Yeah, if you can find Deborah Henderson's talk, she also did talk about that in 2013, I think, at GDC. It came up in there. So, but that's a really big deal, right? Our impulse is to mock up and test, right? That's what user experience does. The earlier we can mock it up and the earlier we can test it, the better our results are, the better the return on investment is. Like, we all know that, but mocking up a story is not a simple proposition. So there's got to be some knowledge to get out there. There was a hand up. Oh, here you go.
So I find that when we're doing early tests of the narrative, it's not really pacing tests that we're doing. At least in my case, I work with a lot of really strong IPs that have already been established. So it's more if the story that we're presenting is believable in the world that has already been established, is what we're doing in the early tests, and the pacing comes later when we do have more assets to add in. So I'm not sure that pacing at the beginning would necessarily be a narrative focus.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, when our testing, we find that when we use terms like pacing, we then have to explain them to the people who we're testing. And we do a lot of that, like agency. We talk about agency, and they go, what? Like special agents agency? And then we have to explain what agency is, and then we've kind of already messed up the question, right? It's like when Bugs Bunny is getting drafted in the Army, and he goes for his exam, and the doctor says, what color is this red card? And we've kind of screwed up the question before we ask it, so.
This isn't something that we've looked into, but I'm hoping someone will at some point. But as a player, playing through, I love RPGs, long-form games, but I have a young son now, and so sometimes I might not touch the game for 2 weeks. And there's a lot of games out there where they don't remind you what you're supposed to do next or what's going on in the story. And at that point, oftentimes I'll just walk away from the game because I don't have the cues anymore. So I'm really curious to see if anyone's doing any research or plans to do any research into how to kind of re-engage players who take long breaks from their long-form games.
Does anybody have any insight on that? I have an anecdote on it. You want to? All right. Well, I had this happen with Inquisition, which was a great game, and I played a lot of. And then partway through, my kids got sick, and I really wasn't able to do anything with it for several months. And I came back, and I was, as people are, completely lost. I had no idea what I was doing. What was interesting about it was I discovered a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know was there, which was that BioWare had put a whole bunch of little sort of quest summary descriptions into this journal. I never look at the journal. Who looks at the journal, right? But it's in there, and it actually explains how you got here and what you're trying to do next and why. It may have just, I don't know if the whole game had that sort of done the way it did, but there was enough there, and it was maybe 2 paragraphs. And there was enough there that I was able to look at that and go, right, yeah, that's right. That's why I'm doing this, because elves, right? But otherwise I was like, why am I going to this ruin in the middle of what am I doing here? And why is this empress such a pain? So I didn't have that context, but I was able to get it pretty quickly with a summary, even though it had all fallen out of my head by that point. So, I think just anecdotally, that would be one place to look if you're looking at how to do this. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Yeah. I should start throwing this thing.
Well, I think the issue with games is that there are a lot of details that you have to encode, and then if you wait a long period of time, then they all decay. And so if you haven't reached like the crescendo or the real narrative beat that all those details have been building up to, then you don't extract the gist of what's been happening in the story up to that point. And so I think that's a real problem. And so I think it'd be great if people did, if developers did provide cues as to what you've just done and what you've experienced, and kind of reactivate those traces. Because what we find in research is that memory for details is very, very fragile and decays over a course of like 2 days, but memory for inferences, as I'm going on about, sticks around, and that's what you really remember over years, And so if you don't reach that inference, then you're not going to remember it without some sort of cues or reminders to tell you what's going on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, one thing that we were speculating about was, anybody here familiar with Bartlett's work, 1932, 33, War of the Ghosts? Yeah, I'm seeing some nodding here. Yeah, one of the things that I noticed about this was, one of the things that I find, or I have found in this, although we don't have any much literature on this, is when a story schema fits. And what Bartlett found, for those of you who don't read obscure psychology articles from history, Bartlett was this guy who did a study on looking at a fairy tale from a Native American culture which doesn't use the same story schemas that we do. Story schemas are like Mad Libs, like fill in the blank. So like, there was a blank, and they went to a castle to rescue a blank, and they fought a blank, and they went home and inherited half of a blank. And most of you who grew up in the West can tell me what those words were, or have a pretty good sense of what those words were, because that's a story that we're sort of used to. But if you go to a culture that doesn't have that sort of Western story schema system, you get this situation where there's stories that don't follow that pattern. And what Bartlett found was, if you showed Westerners, in his case, sort of middle-class British people, a story like that, and then you ask them about it later, they change the story to match what they think the story should have been, which I think really sort of points out that if we don't, especially when we're talking about episodic narratives, for instance, I know that's become something in the last few years that's been a lot more common. If we're not adhering fairly closely to those existing story schemas, which often we want to violate that on purpose, right, to make it interesting, but if we do violate it, are we in fact making it hard for people to remember what should have happened or what did happen because they're busy fitting in what should have happened, right? So that's something that, we haven't done any work on that, but it is something we sort of talked about, and it seems like something we should collectively have to think about occasionally. There was a question that came in on pacing. I know we had some insight into that earlier. Did anybody else have any thoughts on how to test pacing, how to see if pacing is working?
So this is actually something that we saw through tests on Pillars and then on the Pathfinder's adventure card game. So when we came to pacing, there was a couple things that we look for, right? We look for how engaged are you, engage indicators, and then also like at what level do you drop off? Because there's always a level, and this depends on like age as well, but like there's levels at which people drop off attentively. It has a lot of different factors that like kind of go into it, but there are averages. And the biggest one that we look for was through pacing, right? So like, how can we pace it such that it makes people want to continuously be engaged, and how much is it that's just overwhelming? Because that happens if you overwhelm them quickly or too quickly. It makes them drop off, right? And so there's this kind of fine line that you have to go through. So some of the ways that we tested pacing was, so gentleman up front actually mentioned this earlier, so combining features with the script to kind of see how they react to it, be it like art assets or just like videos of mock-ups and prototyping of different series. We did that to see how people felt about storylines, and then like handed them story pieces to pick through. And you could see at certain levels, depending how much information they were given, and then how much new information they were given versus like reiterating of information, how that would change their attentiveness. And we tried to keep it so that no individual became tired of a certain type of trope, I guess, like less than an hour, right? So you want to see if they can keep going for 60 minutes or more. And at first, we were not successful, but it became very evident that people were looking for like pops, things that would change. They wanted change, which is funny because most people are like, I don't like change in things, but in story, they want that change because it's something different. And so we realized very quickly that we needed to keep injecting change into the story, even if it's just enough that it makes them have a question. And as soon as they asked, they were like, oh, I have a question about this now, they kept going, right? And so for us, it was like a matter of how do we keep asking questions so that it keeps them moving, but not so fast that they ignore a bunch of information too. So that was another problem we had with pacing, was how do we keep it going at such a rate that's interesting without them ignoring or losing information. These are just things that we came across in our testing, but we have no perfect answer still. Like, we're still going through these iterations. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting that you mentioned change, because it seems also part of what Deborah Henderson was also saying is that, when participants were told to remember, to recollect a story from a video game, they could actually recollect it much less and describe it with much less words than they would other media such as movies or books. And part of that is because they were relating more to parts where they were acting and they were doing something, so they were bringing about some kind of a change. And that's why sometimes, like, narrative points that were related to gameplay were remembered more strongly. And Ken Levine also was talking about, how to make characters like NPCs with passions, like with a capital P, right? If you guys heard that. And what's important is for the player to know that they can influence those passions. They can make a change, because if the NPC has something that the player can't do anything about, that's not as memorable, because there's nothing that you can do in the game. So.
I think we're running out of time. We're scheduled till 4:45, right? So we only got a few more minutes. There's a question up here, though. There's a question up here about that you guys can probably see better than me explaining it, but just for the purpose of the camera here. Anyone with experience evaluating already established narrative as a game's new or different take, like a Batman narrative versus Arkham Knight. So yeah, I mean, I can see how that could be if there's an established canon of information, and then suddenly we're taking a different approach to it, like it's an open world game versus a sort of linear, progressive narrative context. I can see how that'd be a problem. Has anybody dealt with that problem? Have any insights into how to address it? Oh, here.
Mostly it's a matter of curiosity about how that worked for the Assassin's Creed games too, since there's a historical narrative that already exists, and then whatever the Assassin's Creed games did to that narrative. I'm curious about if there's anybody who has experience with those.
Anybody work on Assassin's Creed games in here? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller?
So I guess it came down, and this is kind of sad to say, it came down to two things. One, people are massively ignorant about history. Massively. The one that was the most, because you don't expect people to really understand what was happening in Venice or Jerusalem, but when we were doing Assassin's Creed 3 set in the United States, and everyone was, people were like, oh, are these the redcoats? Is this the revolution? Like, nobody had any idea. It may have had something to do with the fact that they were Canadian, so we don't really give a damn about your history. Other than that one time in 1810 when we beat you. So, and then the other part is, I think Assassin's Creed is fairly well established as playing in the gray zone of history, so we're allowed to lie a little bit so people sort of don't get too upset. They did find what we saw was particularly on EC3, so it swings back and forth between how much we play with it. People did not particularly like the Forrest Gumpiness of Assassin's Creed 3, where you were literally in every major thing that ever happened. And then on the flip side of that, in Black Flag, where you weren't part of history at all, really, you were just a pirate in that time period. And so they're trying to sort of, there's a middle ground in between there where people want references that they get, but they don't want it to necessarily be like too in their face. But I think that's very specific to the type of game that Assassin's Creed is. I don't know that that's something that would extrapolate well to literally anything else.
Yeah, thanks. Assassin's Creed is one of those franchises that does have a huge amount of story in it and has a lot of visibility, so it's obviously a good place to gain insights into this. Anybody have any last thoughts? We're right at 4:45 right now, so just anybody dying to say anything? All right, well, thank you so much for your contributions. You guys really made this, I think, a productive experience. So we're going to try to aggregate all the stuff we have here. If anybody, this link's going to stay open, so if anybody has anything that they want to contribute or they run across, please throw it up here, and we're going to try to figure out some way to get it back to you so you guys can look at it. But you guys all know where it is. You can take a look at it anytime now or in the future. Add things to it, take stuff away from it. So thanks again for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.